Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast from Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, President of Zaytuna College, joins us to reflect on Dr. Thomas Cleary's brilliant rendering of God's Final Testament. Cleary's translation, remarkable for its clarity and precision, presents the Qur'an as a living text, inviting both Muslim and non-Muslim readers into its ethical and contemplative dimensions. Recorded live at the 2025 festival, in partnership with Zaytuna College, explore how this faithful rendition of the Qur'an holds true to its greatest purpose, to soak the soul in its recital and timeless message.
Welcome. I'm very happy to be back here in Bradford for this literary festival. I hope, inshallah, that it continues to flourish and get bigger and better. Each year that I've come, this is my third year, it's always improved, and so that's always a good sign that people don't get satisfied with where they're at, but always attempt to improve. Today, I mentioned this last year, and alhamdulillah, the Hamziya came out, so we literally just got copies of it yesterday. And inshallah, this book that I'm going to be discussing today, inshallah, next year we'll have it here for you. So I'm doing, instead of launching a book, I'm basically doing a teaser campaign. The title of this talk comes from an email from Dr. Thomas Cleary, who is probably, I think, the single most intelligent human being I've ever known. He is somebody who I think over time will be more and more recognized for the extraordinary giant that he was, and also what he was doing, which is very sophisticated. But he translated the essential Qur'an. He began, I think, working on that in the early 90s. And I actually found out about him in an article in New Age magazine, which was actually in a hospital, and I just picked it up to read while I was waiting for my wife to give birth to our first son. And there was an article about Dr. Thomas Cleary in there and a picture of him. And in the article, it was about his translation of The Art of War. And it was actually initially commissioned by Time magazine. And I ended up getting in touch many, many years later with the man who interviewed him and was able to secure for Dr. Cleary's wife 12 hours of his interview with him, because he interviewed him over 3 days. And it was an incredible interview, but some big event ended up happening. I think it was the Iraqi War or something. And so Time did not publish the article, so New Age magazine bought it from him. And so I read it, but it was about his art of war. And then at the end it said, consider his next project, translating the Qur'an from the original Arabic, which really struck me as very strange, because I knew Dr. Cleary from his Asian translations. I did not know that he knew Arabic, and I suspected that he might be. There's a certain scholar in the United States, I won't mention his name just out of courtesy, but he doesn't really know the languages he translates into, but he gets existing translations, and he's a very good wordsmith. And I thought maybe he was doing that with the Qur'an. I would later find out that he was a master of the Arabic language. And I think he himself said that he had mastered 8 languages, but he knew several others, but he would not consider himself. He had a very high bar for what he considered to be mastery of a language. But I ended up writing him a letter, and lo and behold, he wrote me back. And that began we did some things together, and the very first time that he invited me into his office, we just sat for 2 hours in silence. It was a very interesting experience. He did not say anything, and I just enjoyed the experience. But he was a very unusual human being. And so in this email that he sent to the Starlatch, who I've tried to collect as many emails as I can from different people, because we're really trying to document all that he did. He sent this email and he said, I really want this to be a soaking of the soul in the recital. And that was the words that he used for what he was doing. He really wanted to he thought one of the most extraordinary things about the Qur'an was that it was a scripture that was read by multitudes. He said most religious traditions do not have the multitudes of their adherents reading the sacred scripture on a daily basis like the Muslims do. And he thought that was so extraordinary. And so he wanted to really do a recital in English for people that did not have access to the Arabic. And that was his intention. Before we go into that, I just want to do a brief history of the Qur'an in Western languages. The reason that the Qur'an comes into the Western languages is because of the Crusades. The Europeans, unfortunately, there was al-Hakam who was a Fatimid ruler. He was probably insane. I mean, I think that's actually recognized by his contemporaries. But he ended up burning down the Church of the Sepulchre. They used that. News traveled slowly in those days, so about 100 years later, the Pope used it as an excuse to invade the Muslim countries, right? And they always do this. They have to create the hype before they go in. So very common. Iran's going to get nuclear bombs next week, right? They start saying that, I think, around 2000 or 1998 or something. They're just 2 weeks away from the bomb, even though Iran is a non-aggressive state. They haven't had an aggressive war in several hundred years. They've been aggressed upon a lot. And you can't blame people now because the only people that aren't invaded are people that have nuclear weapons. So even if you can't really blame people that want to get nuclear weapons, unfortunately, because it seems it's the only way to get respect in this world. So these crusades begin 1099, really 1096, but 1099, they actually, 15,000 crusaders come in. So there's a very interesting character named Peter the Venerable, and he believed in a different approach to the Muslims. Don't kill them, let's actually discuss things with them. And so he actually commissioned a comprehensive translation. He actually studied with Muslim scholars in Spain. He was the abbot of Cluny. But he said, that our people often do by arms, right? But we should do it by words, not by force, but by reason, not in hatred, but in love. So believe it or not, an actual Christian. So Kierkegaard said the problem with Christianity is there's only been one Christian in Christian history. So this is Robert of Ketton, who's an Englishman, believe it or not, who studied Arabic. And he gives this Latin translation, which then moves into English through a French translation. So this is translated from Arabic into French and then translated from French into English by Alexander Ross in 1649. This was King Charles who loses his head. And then you get George Sale. And George Sale is amazing because in 1734, he produces a remarkable Qur'an, surprisingly. It's very accurate. One wonders about his own beliefs because he is really doing a remarkable job in there and using Muslim sources. So if you read it, you'll see that it has excellent notes. It was the first Qur'an that I actually read, which is very odd because it's not really read anymore, but it was the first one that I read. It's in older English, obviously, but amazing work. And very interesting because Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, has the albatross around the neck. Coleridge got that from George Sale's Qur'an because of the ta'ir that's around the unuq, of the bird of sins that's worn around the thing. So Coleridge was interested and had read that, and that's all been shown. I don't think anybody's written on that, but then amazing, you start getting these Muslim translations of the Qur'an into English. The Muslims tended not to translate the Qur'an because they believed that it was not translatable into another language. And I think there's definitely an argument for that because of the nature of Arabic, because of the just extraordinary nature of the Arabic root system, all of the possibilities, the Arabic syntax, the fact that you have qira'at that also give different meanings, tabayyanu, tathabbatu, in Surah Al-Hujurat 49. So it's written exactly the same way, but the two qira'at, which are both factual qira'at, they're completely different words. So you will find that. It's not that common in the Qur'an, but you will find these differences which give nuanced meanings. But you had the Qur'an into Muhammad Abd al-Hakim Khan in 1905, and then 1916, 1917, and then you get the famous Marmaduke Pickthall, who was a very interesting, he was a very popular writer in England. He was very well read, but when he became Muslim, his literary career took a dive. He ended up going to India, and he was supported by the Nizam of Hyderabad, and he actually did a good Qur'an. They were all influenced, these later Qur'ans, by Maulana Muhammad Ali, who was from the Lahori Ahmadi, not from the Qadiani, but from the Lahori Ahmadi community. And it is, it's a very interesting Qur'an. It does have some problems in it, but the Al-Azhar at the time actually approved it, surprisingly. And then you have the famous Yusuf Ali Qur'an, which is pushed initially, it was published and then really became, if people who remember back in the 90s, everybody read the Yusuf Ali Qur'an. So he was from India. He was a lover of the English language, so you'll see Shakespeare in all his notes and things. Bruce Lawrence, who wrote a very worthwhile book called The Qur'an, a Biography in English, which is where a lot of my information is coming from. It's worth reading for anybody that's interested in how the Qur'an moved into the English language. But he said the influence of Maulana Muhammad Ali is huge on the translators that come after him. Now you get this plethora of just amazing number of translations that have come out recently. Of all the translations, in my estimate, I still feel that Arthur John Arbery just did an incredible job. I think he was gifted in that he was a genuine master of the English language, but he was also, he knew Arabic rhetoric very well. He wrote on Arabic rhetoric. He knew the schemes and figures of Arabic. And he had just a deep and abiding love for the Qur'an. He mentions how the Qur'an really helped him through some of the most difficult times in his life. But I really think he did something extraordinary. And now we get to Dr. Cleary's translation. Dr. Cleary, in his business card, all it said was Thomas Cleary, didn't have PhD or anything, and it said, the translator. That was his calling card. His actual computer code was Tarjuman, which is Arabic for translator. He, from an early age, decided to be a translator. Despite his incredible brilliance, he actually wrote very few books. He did write some books of his own. But one of the things that I found most fascinating about his works is that his notes are some of the most interesting things in the books. His own personal reflections on what he was translating. And he was just so gifted from an early time. I really genuinely think he was a Malamatiya. I think that's how he viewed himself, in that tradition of self-abnegation, making people think that he was kind of nothing. In his 10-year anniversary of high school, everybody had all of their, all their accomplishments. And this is a man who got a full scholarship in mathematics to Harvard and ended up doing a BA, MA, PhD in 6 years, summa cum laude. He put for his accomplishments, inveterate, reprobate, and ne'er-do-well. That was all it said next to his name. Everybody else had like 2 paragraphs of all they'd done since high school. So this is his high school picture. He was very proud of his Irish heritage. One of the select 6. He was a Golden Gloves boxer. He was a martial artist. He studied the martial arts of Asia as well, but he did Qigong on a regular basis, but he was a serious Golden Gloves fighter. He actually sparred with Reuben Hurricane Carter, so he was a sparring partner to him. So he's a serious boxer, very strong man. If you ever met him, you could see that he was extraordinary. Brains and brawn were how he was described. A subtle wit, a soaring javelin. He won the New Jersey javelin throwing championship. Clearly outstanding Tom. So that's how his fellow classmates described him. He also won the statewide Latin medal with his brother. So we have a picture of him. It says Romulus and Remus. So he was a Latin scholar. I think it was the first language that he had mastered, which would help him incredibly. It's over 100 books. This is a later thing. He has over 100 books. We actually don't know all the books that he translated because, for instance, he translated the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah, which is on Kindle it's just under Darwish. So it doesn't even say that he translated it. So he put a lot of things on Kindle. I haven't identified all of them because he got so fed up with publishers. And in any case, he translated works from Pali, from Sanskrit, from Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Old Irish. He learned Gaelic and actually translated the Book of Cormac, which is a book of Irish wisdom. And he lived in Oakland, California. I think he chose Oakland because of Gertrude Stein's famous statement, "There is no there." These are some of the books that had Islamic themes. His first was the Essential Qur'an. The notes are stunning if you look at the notes. And then he did a full translation of the Qur'an. He did not want to have an introduction. He said, "Who am I to introduce God's word?" So he did not do an introduction in that one purposefully. And then he did the Wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ. It's a beautiful collection of sayings. Living and Dying in Grace, which is Hadrat Sayyidina Ali. He had a special love for the wisdom teachings of Sayyidina Ali. And then he did this very interesting book called Living a Good Life. And it's a book of wisdom, advice and wisdom from the Greek masters. So it's all Socrates and Aristotle and all these ancient Greeks, but it's from the Arabic sources. So there's a whole, translated from Arabic, but then if you look at it, he's constantly using hadith and sayings of Ali to explain them. So it's very interesting. And then he translated Khalil and Dimna, which, if you haven't read that, it's an amazing work of Indian wisdom literature. They call it the Machiavelli of India, but Machiavelli of India. But it's a stunning book. We read it in my book club. If you're not in it, I hope you join. And then this book, it was such a strange title. The Twilight of the Goddess. I never read it until after he died. I thought, I'm going to read it. And it's just, what he did in this book is so interesting. He wrote it with Sartez Aziz, a Bengali Muslim lady who he worked very closely with. So it's spiritual feminism and feminine spirituality. So it's something, obviously, any woman who has feminist inclinations, but also spiritual inclinations, would be interested in. But what he does in it is just so stunning because he takes them to Islamic feminine spirituality at the end. So the last 4 chapters are just about Muslim women. And his insights into Khadija are, I can't read it without being reduced to tears. I've done it more than once, and it has the same impact on me every time. And then he talks about marriage and the importance of marriage from the Qur'an. The twin souls, reverencing the womb, saintly women, and the marriage that pervades all of creation. And they're all his quotes at the beginning of the chapters are from the Qur'an, or from the Prophet, or from Sayyidina Ali. Another thing that he does, which is very interesting, is he embeds in his books about Buddhism these very interesting things. So in the Dhammapada, which he translated from Pali, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, of the sayings of Buddha. In one of the chapters, it says, "Who is capable of praising one like a coin of finest gold? One whom the knowing praise after finding him impeccable, controlled, intelligent, insightful, ethical, and composed of day in and day out. Even the gods praise such a one, even the Creator." And then he just puts in a little note, the name of the last of the Abrahamic tradition who embodied these qualities literally means praised one. A similar description is given in the hymn of Torah. So he sticks these things in because he actually, in a personal letter he wrote to me, he said, most Western people cannot think about thinking about Islam. It's just not a consideration. And he said he considered himself a spy who was bringing wisdom across the prejudiced barriers of the human mind. And so he's sneaking these things in because most people in the West that are interested in Buddhism, they're very educated. They wouldn't even consider Islam. And then he sticks that in there, and it's suddenly, who's he talking about there? Here's another one. He wrote this on No Barrier, Unlocking the Zen Koan. And he says, this use of koans to test mentalities requires a certain degree of psychological knowledge to apply. So he's saying that Zen koans are used to test the mental state of people. A simple method uses the prejudices of the environment, casually providing appropriate stimuli to observe whether an individual or group is infected with the habitual prejudices of the cultural environment, or whether evidence is shown of capacity for independent thought and perception. This is one of his most important goals in his work, is to help people see their conditioned thinking, their biases, their prejudices, and to be able to become independent thinkers and to think. And I'm going to use him in the talk about Jane Austen as well, about this, because he really had some incredible insights. So he says in the same book, in a Western milieu, for example, environmental prejudice is easily elicited by reference to Islam. So here's somebody who's reading about Zen koans, who thinks they're probably liberal and educated and, open-minded, like a parachute. The inclination, but then he says, when people with no knowledge of the Qur'an or usages of the Prophet, and this really struck me, usages, it's such an amazing term for sunnah. I don't think anybody has ever used this term as far as I know, but if you look up usages, it's a standard practice, right? So it's what's instituted and people should adhere to it, like usages of language, the proper usage of English. And so he used that term, and it's such a beautiful term for sunnah, or the usages of the Prophet, are ready to offer opinions on Islam as fact. So they've never read the Qur'an, they've never read anything the Prophet said. This represents the working of conditioned bias, not the operation of independent cognition. The inclination to accept unverified opinions simply because of currency or familiarity is a dangerous human weakness that is instrumental in self-deception and easily exploited for the deception of others. So now, I argue that this is a master's translation because he was a master translator. And we've really seen this, we segmented this into 6 different, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they're very different because he was working on this. Unfortunately, I was going to have a slide of the way he translated the Qur'an. He wrote out the entire Qur'an, and he told me he could only translate between 2 and 4 in the morning, the Qur'an. He wasn't able to translate it any other time. And this is several years of work that he was working on this. So he really gave it his all. But he wrote out the entire Qur'an by hand on one half of the workbooks he was using. And then on the other, he would do a deep analysis of all the words and their root meanings. There's a lot of Chinese ideograms in this also, because he was using a Chinese translation of the Qur'an and looking at how they translated it also. As far as we could tell, he's not influenced by any translators. We could not see this. He really did this for himself. I think one of the most interesting things about translation, and this is the dilemma of translation, should a good translation edge its own language towards that of the original? And many translators, and I've been translating for many years, and initially my early translations, I really adhered to the kind of Arabic idiomatic nature of the language. It always ended up sounding clunky. It just did not work. They're very different languages. The syntax, we have a SVO, subject, verb, object in linguistics. Arabic has a OVS, VSO. It can do many, many different things. And so it's just a very different language syntactically as well as idiomatically. The Arabs, in the West, we're colder people, so we say that this warms my heart. The Arabs say this cools my heart. So that's creating a deliberate aura of strangeness. It just does not sound like it's from the language you're translating into. Of peripheral opaqueness. So it becomes difficult. What does that actually mean? Those who privilege the original text would answer in the affirmative. Or should a good translation naturalize the character of the linguistic import so as to make it at home in speech of the translator and readers? Those who privilege the target audience would answer yes. He definitely is in that latter category of translator. I think one of the geniuses of Muslim civilization is they never Arabized their cultures. Wherever they went, they indigenized. They let the people know, we didn't come here to change your culture. If anything, we came here just to help you determine what's good, what's bad. And that's why Chinese mosques look like pagodas, the mosques of India look like Hindu temples, the mosques of Turkey look like Orthodox churches, the mosques of Andalusia look like Visigothic churches. This was the genius of the Muslims. Even the dress, this modern Arab dress, which is robe, is actually from Persia. It's not from Arabia. It was adopted by the notable Arabs when they moved into the very highly civilized Persian cultures. This is why you can see all the ancient Persian kings wearing robes. The Prophet ﷺ wore multicultural clothes. He had a Yemeni jubba. He wore a Roman shirt that had tight sleeves. He had a shirt from Ethiopia. He was letting his people know there's no Muslim dress. The hallmark of Muslim dress is modesty. And so whatever culture you're in, dress like the people. In Adab ad-Din wa Dawla, Adab ad-Din wa Dunya, Al-Mawardi says, when you're in a place, you should always dress like the people of that place. Because he said, if you don't, the ignorant among them will aggress upon you because they see you as strange. So here's another really interesting thing about his translation. This is the only, as far as I know, non-gendered translation of all the words that refer to God. Dr. Cleary did this in 1993 because he recognized that there is a barrier with a lot of people in the West now about gendered language related to God. And so he chose, and this is what he says in his amazing introduction in the Essential Qur'an. One particular problem in translating the Qur'an into modern English is the pronominal reference to God. So the pronominal, anything to do with pronouns. Like in Arabic, you have what's called a pronominal suffix. We don't have that in English. I can say, biyadihi malakutu samawati wal ard. So that he is attached to yed, like the hand. We don't have that in English. We say his hand. But in Arabic, you have these very different ways. And also, so anyway, he says, in contemporary English, there is no third-person pronoun perfectly suited to refer to the transcendent God beyond all human conception. The ultimate shortcoming of human language is natural, of course, not particular or peculiar to English. But there are particular reasons for attending to the problem of the third-person pronoun. Many people of Jewish and Christian background feel alienated from their native faith by what they call the angry old man image of God, with which they have been taught to associate religion. Furthermore, what has been perceived as the masculine bias of this image is particularly well known to have alienated many Western women from monotheism. This would seem to be an unnecessary waste. People, they hear you say God the Father, or you say God, he said, and suddenly it's like, oh, is a man telling me what to do? So and there are names of God like Al-Wadud, which is a male and female. It applies to both men and women. The loving, it's in a form in Arabic that can apply to like Arus is male or female. That form Fa'ul can be male or female. So he says, to avoid short-circuiting the attention of significant segments of the modern audience at such a rudimentary stage, I have translated the third-person Arabic pronoun huwa, hu, as referring to God as God, or God as truth, rather than as referring to the English pronoun he or him. In technical terms, this means that since the fundamental linguistic resource is the power of reference, so this is what language has, the ability to refer to something else. This is the power of language. Like I can say apple, and you all you could think of a green apple, a red apple. You could think of an apple with worms. There are a lot of different apples you could think of, but you all can think of this thing that has an essential nature called appleness. And this is the power. If I said tufah in Arabic, or manzanilla in Spanish, or ringo in Japanese, if you understand those languages, you'll think of the same thing. This is the power of language to refer symbolically to things that either exist concretely or abstractly. And so what he's saying is this is the power of reference. One technique for handling difficulties in translation begins with considering language from this point of view. Inasmuch as languages do differ, it is axiomatic that manners of reference can never be completely or perfectly aligned from language to language. Therefore, the attempt to do so does not in itself reproduce equivalent powers of reference. Thus, the first priority of translation in terms of meaning is to seek to engage the power of reference as efficiently as possible in whatever manner the target language may afford. So this is a master translator who really understands this problem at a really deep level. And then he says that Allah tells us in the Qur'an, the injunction of the Qur'an to call God by the most beautiful names. So I have generally rendered pronominal reference to the divine as God or the truth or something like that. So this is what he does. So he said in an unpublished introduction to the Qur'an, he said that the Qur'an speaks of itself in these terms. This is the book without doubt, in it guidance for the conscientious, those who believe in the unseen and who practice regular prayer and who give of what we have provided them, and those who believe in what was revealed to you and what was revealed before you and who are certain of the hereafter. They follow guidance from their Lord and they are the felicitous ones. Then he says, the Qur'an calls to conscience, constancy, and charity, to reason, responsibility, and resolve, to patience, moderation, and humility, to justice, equity, and integrity, to decency, truthfulness, and gratitude, to prayer, work, and wisdom. So he has basically essentialized the message of the Qur'an. Bruce Lawrence, in that book, The Qur'an in English, a biography, says, Dr. Cleary's work is exceptional both for its minimalism and its creativity. Recently, Sandal Burke has mined Cleary in constructing his own hybrid version of the Qur'an. He transcribed all 2,036 verses to match the sacred text with visual accents in his American Qur'an. So this is an author, he's a visual artist. And he said, I probably would have used Cleary mostly because it seems to me more concise and clear and simple to me, but I'm worried that one of those translators would be upset if I used their translation. In a private email to somebody who shared this email with me, he said, now I'm working out an exegesis of the Qur'an that came to me in a dream, and then he wrote ru'ya, of an intricate crystal structure reaching to an infinite horizon. Part of it consists of alignment of readings associated with the disconnected letters. This is something I never thought of before and never consciously noticed. But so far it is in fact working with crystalline precision and clarity. It's hard to do too much at once, though, because it's like standing in a high wind. It's such a powerful blast. And then in a follow-up email, he said he sent actually his initial, what he realized is if you take the Alif Lam Mim surahs, so if you begin with Baqarah and you go to Alif Lam Mim and then it's ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. If you take those 2 to 5, and then you take the next Ali Imran 2 to 5, and you keep going on all the Alif Lam Mim, he said you will get a whole other message that's actually consistent. And he said he found it was consistent throughout with the muqatta'at letters that shared. And he said there's parallels also with the Alif Lam Mim Ra, with the Alif Lam Mim. And then he saw relationships between the root words that were related in that. So he said, all the letter chapters work like this as far as I can tell. Also, the Alif Lam Mim Sad parallels can be used to caption the Alif Lam Mim series, and the Alif Lam Mim series can be captioned with the Alif Lam Mim Ra parallels. Peering through these gates makes me feel like I'm looking directly into the Big Bang, standing naked in a strong wind. The next part is the foundation of root concepts chartered by the chaptered letters in the text of each lettered chapter. If you look at some of the things that he does, so the matrix of the book is a really nice translation of Kitab, because matrix comes from a Latin word which means mother, but it's also a matrix is something that engenders or produces lots of things. So the Kitab is the book that produces all of the meanings. And then also he says, as for those with perversion in his heart, there are others that use that, but perversion is very accurate for zayg, which is, perversion is an aberration, a deviance or a departure from something, which is what zaghi, yazighu is. Also, this was a very interesting, and he certainly really knew all these root words, and so we think that he probably preferred accepted because God already owns everything, and so to say, that he's purchased from the believers themselves I think he's accepted their persons and their property in exchange. So he used it as a exchange, but he already owns them. And then he uses bargain. What a bargain. In the light verse, it's oil nearly luminous. Yakadu zaytuha yudi'u. And then he also uses a very interesting, and God is cognizant of everything. In the Arabic, it's Wallahu bi kulli shay'in alim. Cognizant has not just knowledge, but an awareness. Because you can have knowledge of something, but then being constantly aware of that thing. So it's a very interesting, we didn't find that in other translations. This one, the light verse is obviously one of the most quoted and recited verses, but in the second part of this, he has this amazing وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَعْمَالُهُمْ كَسَرَابٍ بِقِيعَةٍ يَحْسَبُهُ الظَّمْآنُ أو يحسب different قراءات ماء حتى إذا جاءه لم يجده شيئا ووجد الله. He says, as for those who scoff, and he translates kafir, he actually, in one thing, he said, kafir is not unbeliever because unbeliever is a passive act. He said kafir is an active participle. And so the kafir is actively doing something. So he using, I think, maybe Izutsu's methodology, he really sees that kafir in the Qur'an has different meanings. It's scoffer, it's denier, it's atheist. And so he translates it different way. Ingrate is another one, somebody who lacks gratitude. But he says their works are like a mirage on a plane. And then Dr. Cleary's interpretation is works emanating from human folly are based on subjective considerations and thus ultimately prove objectively insubstantial. Or like the darknesses. This again refers to the works of ingrates who refuse to acknowledge the source of all being. The ocean is their consciousness. The darknesses are layers of ignorance. The waves are impulsive imaginings. The waves upon waves are rationalizations of their imaginings. The clouds are biases and blind spots. If one stretched forth a hand, one would hardly see it. The ignorance and blindness of the ungrateful not only hinders them from acknowledging the ultimate end, it veils them from the truth of what is near at hand. Whoever God gives no light has no light at all. All true knowledge is from truth, capital T. Subjective human imagination has no connection with ultimate reality. So that was his interpretation of those verses. Another one is really fascinating, and Bruce Lawrence had trouble with this, no pun intended there, when they are told not to make trouble on earth. Usually this is translated as sow corruption, but trouble, when we actually ended up looking at it, it's just such a better word. So in his note on this, he said, make trouble. This expression is derived from the root fasada, which in the first measure means to be or become bad, rotten, spoiled, corrupt, unsound, false, wrong. Here it is derived from the fourth measure, which means to spoil, deprave, corrupt, demoralize, pervert, distort, ruin, foil, undermine, weaken, thwart. So he knew what it meant. Pious fools and hypocrites pretending to be faithful believers may cause all sorts of degradation and corruption by their falsehoods without even realizing it, being mesmerized by their own facades. So he used that, but if you look at the word trouble, it has all of these amazing meanings. One of them is civil strife, mental agitation. So he was an Irish historian, has written a lot on Irish history, but he actually knew the word the Troubles in Ireland means the Civil War in Ireland. So he understood trouble was actually le mot juste, as the French say. It's like the perfect word. And then no compulsion in religion. This is one of the most beautiful explanations of that verse that I've ever seen. There is no compulsion in real religion because truth is objectively distinct from error by its own nature. The essence of error is idolatry, which means treating something relative as if it were absolute. So one of the things that he said is that if you're compelled to do something, it's not from faith. So la ikraha fi din means that you're actually doing it voluntarily, which is the essence of real faith. So here he says, كَذَلِكَ جَزَاءُ الْكَافِرِينَ. In a note he said, slay unbelievers wherever you find them is not what the Qur'an says. The opponents referred to in 191 are named in 190 as those who fight you. So the people that hate Islam love to quote that ayah. قَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ is the first part. وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. Don't be aggressors. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. So they quote the next ayah, وَاقْتُلُوهُمْ حَيْثُ ثَقِفْتُمُوهُمْ وَأَخْرِجُوهُمْ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَخْرَجُوكُمْ. Kill them wherever you find them. But they don't say that this is a response to their aggression. It's not telling you to aggress. And this is a proof that there's no, this was a khilaf in early Islam. Once Islam was adopted by empire, they argued that you could have preemptive warfare. The Arabs said, الروم إذا لا تغزو إذا لا تغزى تغزو. The Europeans are such that if you don't fight them, they're going to fight you. This is now, unfortunately, even though Eisenhower rejected it as an American foreign policy, preemptive strikes, this has become the attitude of aggressive nations, make preemptive strikes, even though there's trumped up justifications for it. It creates a lot of human harm. In any case, he says the opponents referred to in 191 as those who fight you. And similarly, 191 says to eject them from where they ejected you, meaning that fighting or ejection are not proposed as aggressive initiatives. The kafir doesn't really mean unbeliever or infidel, but denier or scoffer. Kafir is an active participle, unbeliever is a passive subjective state, not the same thing as active scoffing or denial, by which one intrudes upon others and upon the public peace. And infidelity does not mean not believing something, but being unfaithful to a prior commitment. And then this is very interesting. So we had initially a hard time. We actually thought this was a mistake. So here, remembrance God. And we debated, we had different sessions on this. And because in the dictionary, if you look up remembrance, it's a noun. But in classical English, it was a verb, and it was used in religious texts. And so remembrance God is actually better than udhkurullah, remember God, because remember God is calling God to mind, but remembrance has the idea also of something that commemorates and acknowledges and magnifies. So it's a really beautiful translation. We didn't find anybody else who used that, remembrance God. And we realized that he must have meant it because he uses it several times. So that's just an example of his incredible creativity. And then here he calls shaitan and marida, which is obviously nakira in Arabic. So when he talks about, he thought, although he acknowledges obviously the demonic realm and Iblis, if you've ever heard his lecture on, yarhamukallah, Imam, if you ever hear the lecture on slavery and Islam, which he did, I actually introduced him at that lecture, but he did an amazing lecture, and he talks about obsession, because he felt like a lot of this demonic thing had to do with a kind of impulsive thoughts that intrude upon people. He talked a lot about the guest and the host, and that a lot of people confuse the unwanted guest with the host, which is your natural state, your principial nature, your fitrah. So you get these thoughts that are unwanted intrusions, and you start identifying yourself with those thoughts, whereas he understood that you have to really kind of set yourself apart from them. And then here again, bima fa'al al-mubtilun, will you then destroy us for what was done by those who trifled with vanities? It's just really unusual. And then also we revealed there was wrongdoers in deviation. Again, this is how he chose to translate khasara, which is usually loss, but that's the loss. Here, very interesting translation for yaqdiru, which usually means yudayiqu alayh. So God expands the provision of anyone who wills and regulates it too. So that was another very interesting. And then this was a really interesting one, which we found no parallel in any translations. So سَنَفْرُغُ لَكُمْ أَيُّهَا الثَّقَلَانِ. So the thaqalan, there's different opinions, but one of the opinions are people that cause a lot of problems in the world. And the heavy-handed people, oppressive. Heavy-handed means oppressive and harsh. That was a heavy-handed way he dealt with it. So that's how he translated the thaqalain, because thaqal obviously has heaviness or weightiness. And then nakhudum al-kha'idin, becoming obsessive along with the obsessed, is a very interesting translation. This probably is one of the most, I don't know any translation that got this. This is called damiru sha'n in Arabic. It's almost invariably translated as say he is God. But Damiru Sha'an is really looking at Qul Huwallah. So it's looking at Huwallah. It's looking at the phrase, and the Damiru Sha'an is to really elevate that phrase. So this is really a much more accurate translation of Qul Huwallahu Ahad. Say, it is God, unique, that we're talking about. It's God we're talking about. Like, that's how Damiru Sha'an is used. So it's a very interesting, one of the Turkish scholars that we had reviewed that was floored by this, because he said it really surprised him that he got that correct. This is one of my favorite of his translations. When he translated فَاسْتَخَفَ قَوْمُهُ فَأَطَاعُوهُ إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا قَوْمًا فَاسِقِينَ. Thus he made his people flippant, and they went along with that, for they were indeed a dissolent people. So flippant, أَسْتَخَفَ قَوْمُهُ, he made his people flippant. So flippant is characterized by, if you look up in the dictionary, it's characterized by levity. Levity, somebody who's characterized by levity. Levity is lightness. Istakhafa means he made them light. He made them light. And so flippant is like, again, le mot juste. It's a really accurate translation. And then he said, and they went along with that. Ata'u. So ta'a is, if you say obedience, a lot of people forget that obedience is actually willful. It's not coercion. When you're obedient, you're willfully doing something. But we tend to associate obedience with coercion just in our natural language. So this is a really interesting, again, using that to make it English. And they went along with that. He made them flippant, and they went along with that, for they were indeed a dissolute people. So flippant right here is frivolously disrespectful, shallow, or lacking in seriousness, characterized by levity. So it really is just an amazing lightness of mind, character, or behavior, lack of appropriate seriousness or earnestness. And then dissolute, indifference to moral restraint, given to immoral or improper conduct. So this is, inshallah, we'll have this for you next year, annotated. We're working on it, but this was done by Abdul Latif Whiteman, and he did not know about his vision of the crystalline horizon going on to infinity, but I thought it really captured that well. In a private email, again, Dr. Cleary said he was sent an article about one of these movements in America, social justice movement, where they were tearing down, rioting and burning things and doing all these things. So he said, Satan asked the Dajjal, how can I get people to promote divisiveness and mutual enmity? The Dajjal said, convince them they are doing it in the name of justice, righteousness, and humanity. Satan says, what if that doesn't work well enough? The Dajjal said, then pay them to do it. I'm gonna, before we sit down here, I just want to read one thing, just because it's inappropriate for the time we're living in. And Dr. Cleary was he's a deeply thoughtful human being, and he had a great, I think, pain in his heart because he was a deeply empathic human being. And he was very troubled by the demonization of the Muslims. And he recommended a book called War Without Mercy. And he said that always when wars are executed, they have to be executed by demonizing the other, because people have a very hard time killing other people. And one of the things that's really horrible that's happening right now in our world is just the dehumanization of these people. I mean, certainly the Palestinian people come to mind, the way these civilians have been treated, and just the callousness with which so many people look on this. Fortunately, there are a lot of people that are, just their humanity is being evoked by a lot of what's happening, but it's really important to not allow all of these horrific events that we are seeing also destroy our own humanity, because there's two responses. One is you can fall into a deep depression, which is exactly what Iblis wants, or you can become callous and just not even be aware of a lot of the things that are happening. So these are two very difficult positions that people find themselves in. But he said about depression, he said one of the main problems of depression is the vicious cycle it produces, as it induces the mind to focus on negativity and then feeds on that negativity. It can be useful to practice observing fluctuations in feelings and trying to note how depression affects interpretations and reactions in such a way as to reflect and reinforce itself. Over time, this effort of awareness can itself help to attain a degree of detachment that provides some room for the mind to maneuver outside that vicious circle. One way to assist this effort is to observe is to start by regarding depression as adventitious rather than inherent. It's something that occurs, that circumstances can bring it about, what they call exogenous. One of the sneaky things about depression is that it pretends to be the host instead of an unruly visitor who barges in and takes over the house. Trying to note when an attitude, interpretation, reaction, thought, or memory is the voice of depression can help develop the ability to catch it at its tricks, stand apart, and not let it complete its self-affirming cycle. Standing apart from it doesn't automatically make it go away, but it provides a chance to defy its debilitating demands. If at first only by a simple willful act like deliberately getting off the couch for a minute. The effort to observe can itself become a task more interesting than spinning the wheels of depression. At times, one can catch that devil at work and laugh at it triumphantly, having caught it in the act instead of being caught by its act and caught up in its act. It's probably common knowledge that isolation encourages depression, and depression increases isolation. One problem that only the depressed person can get past is that you generally can't talk about it. People who don't know what it's like typically say things like, everybody gets depressed, which is really their way of shielding themselves against the pain of empathy, but generally only serves to make the depressed person feel guilty and hurt by the implied suggestion that the depressed person is weak or self-indulgent. Cheer up is another common clueless response that does more harm than good. There is no way to convey the reality of depression to someone who doesn't have the experience, and it wouldn't do any good anyway. So the best way to deal with this is to realize that giving up expectation of understanding is an act of compassion for others, an act of strength and will and love, and to shun any feeling of resentment or loneliness associated with having to keep it to oneself. Then there is the beauty and wonder that God has placed in the world, the incredible, miraculous complexity of the fabric of life. We are barely motes of dust, briefly reflecting infinitesimal flashes of light in the all-pervasive and all-consuming radiance of the divine.
MashaAllah. I think one of the things that, Bismillah, becomes clear as you read Dr. Cleary's translation is that he paid a special attention to how it sounds, because unlike other translations, I think he might be unique in this. He wanted it to be recited aloud. He actually encourages his readers in the Essential Qur'an to recite it aloud in a way that is meant to at least mimic what the Arabic recitation offers. And he even said in that email that in the introduction to the Essential Qur'an, that one of the things that it's meant to do with repeated recitation is to begin to alter one's consciousness. Yeah. So I wanted to ask what you think he offers Western readers in particular in the way that he has sort of laid out his translation. It's more accessible, it's clearer. And I know that you tend to prefer Arbery for its...
Not everybody has access to Arbery.
Yeah, for the modern Western reader, I think Dr. Cleary offers something
Dr. Cleary's a minimalist, but he has an eloquence that's really unusual in that minimalism.
Yeah.
His name is Cleary. He's very clear. A lot of non-Muslims have just really preferred his Quran when they read it. Like I found, and that was his. It's very sad because I didn't mention this, but he had, when he was very young, he worked in an asbestos factory before they knew the effects of asbestos on the lungs, and he actually died from that disease. So he suffered from, which is why he couldn't teach, because he couldn't talk for sustained periods. It was very difficult for him. So he suffered a lot just physically, his wife, amazing Japanese lady, who really has allowed me to have access to all of his work, because we have hundreds of his manuscripts they're really stunning. I think over time, hopefully grad students will be able to see what's there. But he thought he was going to die when he was very young. He was in his early 20s, and he went to Morocco to die. He wanted to die in Morocco. He got interested in Buddhism very early, but he did not see Buddhism as a religion, which is really important, and he made that very clear. He saw Buddhism as a tool to kind of free the mind from a lot of its default settings. And that was a lot of his work, was helping people, free their minds. But he really felt that the Qur'an had this amazing power to alter perception for people that took it seriously. And in his library, all the top shelves were Qur'an and tafsir, all the other, his Chinese and Japanese and other languages, because he knew quite a few languages. But he had the Qur'an on the top. And then he had several of his own translations earmarked, because he liked to dog ear and all of them have multiple dog ears. So he was constantly even looking at his own translation. Yeah. But it really struck him, the power of that constant repetition of reciting the Qur'an. One of the great scholars, Al-Banani, he said, I struggled with the Qur'an for 20 years, and then it revealed itself to me for the next 20. And I think people forget that, that this idea of just repetitious practice, it really has a profound impact over time.
Interesting. They say that since Trump came in, the sales of the Bible have increased, and so also they're saying the same about the Quran, a lot of purchases. And not too long ago, we did that video with Gary Wills, and one of the things that he said is that people would ask me about the Quran, but I never read it, right? And really so he did that book, like What the Quran Meant and Why It Matters. And we did the video on that. But I think now, Shaykh Hamza, since inshallah we're publishing this interpretation of the Quran or translation from Dr. Cleary, I think, what do you think it has to offer to the modern reader now? And then you've touched on it, obviously, with the language, but I think now more than ever, it's more important that people are actually reading this book.
Well, first of all, I genuinely believe that any human being that takes life on earth seriously should know at least something about the major belief systems of the planet that we live on. I don't think you can call yourself educated if you haven't read the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Annex of Confucius, and certainly the Quran. It amazes me. And Gary Wills, to your point, I mean, Gary Wills said, because he was a scholar of religion.
Right.
And so after 9/11, he had all these people, well, you're a scholar of religion, what's the Quran say? And he said he was ashamed to say he'd never read it. And he took 2 years of his life to study it and wrote that remarkable book, What the Quran Means and Why It Matters. And he was very profoundly struck by the Quran. It's a fantastic book and a good book to give to other people. The Essential Quran is a stunning book. What he did, he used Al-Ghazali's methodology because he loved Al-Ghazali, but he used Al-Ghazali's 6 aims of the Quran. But the introduction alone, and I got a call from a great scholar from Bahrain who knows English very well because he did his PhD in Canada. And he asked me, he said, do you know who has the copyright of the Cleary Quran? And I said, actually, we do. And he said, we got to get that Quran out. He's an Arab.
Yeah.
And he said, especially with the introduction from the Essential Quran. So we're working on that. But I think it's a stunning work, and it has a. But let me give you an example. We recently, a lot of people, this is England, and I know you guys have a different set of concerns. But there is an argument that the American election should be globalized, because whoever wins has an effect on the whole planet. So really everybody should have a vote around the world. But, there was a recent discussion between these two, this man Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz. And one of the things that Ted Cruz says is, that the reason he supports Israel is because God tells him to. And he says, where is that in the Bible? And he says, I don't know, And he says, but, you can look it up on Google, right? And Carlson says it's in Genesis, right? So, and it is in Genesis 12, but it doesn't say, it says whoever blesses Abraham, whoever blesses you will be blessed, and whoever curses you will be cursed. And it says, we will make of you a great nation. Well, that's said about two people in the Qur'an. The promise of God is to make the children of Ismail a great nation. God says, I have heard your call, and I will make of Ismail a great nation. Well, a great nation with God can't be great if it's not a religious nation. So who are the Ishmaelites? And then I once called somebody who I know. He's a pastor of a mega church who does a lot of work with Muslims. And I asked him, I said, Pastor, I won't mention his name. I said, have you ever blessed Abraham in your life? And I said, be honest. And he said, I can't think I ever have. And I said, did you know that we bless him every day? Yeah. Like our community all over the world blesses Abraham literally. Kama barakta ala Ibrahim. Wow. I mean, we literally use the word as you blessed Abraham, and so we're the people that bless Abraham. Yeah. We do it every day, the Muslims. So maybe you're better get your cursing and blessing right. So it's important because religious literacy is imperative now. It's a matter of social stability and security. I mean, Muslims in this country, because he has a Muslim name and he's a criminal, it's associated with our religion. It's so unfair to do that. So you should know, does the religion allow for grooming? Is that something the religion promotes? Does the religion allow for stealing? The Muslims are historically, their religion spread because they were such decent people. People wanted to be like them. I mean, if you want to see Islam, just look at the Bengali man who was robbed by that man in America. And then he gets his, the knife away from him, and then he gives him money. He says, don't rob, and then the man says shahada. He gives him shahada. I mean, that's a much better example of how Islam spread than other ways. What was your experience? Just, I'm curious, because you segmented the Quran, and I think one of the things that the people that actually looked at it said was they learned so much about English. Yeah. Right. Because they would find a word and say, that can't be right. And then they'd look, and as number 4, it was like a perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that becomes undeniable as you go through it is it's an absolutely original translation. It's not derivative. Even when, one of the things that the team would do is pull up the other translators alongside. And there was definitely a difference there. There's 2 things I think that struck me. Is the first is Dr. Cleary definitely explored the full semantic field of a term.
Of the word, yeah.
It wasn't just what does
That's
it mean
clear
in
his
this.
Notes.
Yeah, absolutely. And he would try to find and oftentimes succeed in stunning ways to find the term that captured both the semantic field and its particular usage there. I think a lot of times translators would use tafsirs to sort of delineate what it means, and sometimes I think Dr. Cleary would leave it as it was linguistically. Did you notice that as well?
Totally. He definitely had, and I gave him a few of I gave him Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi's. He had al-Qurtubi, he had al-Alusi, he definitely was looking at tafsirs, but he really wanted to experience the Quran linguistically, like avoiding as much as possible what was said about it. Yeah. And it's important because one of the problems with translating the tafsirs is they were for their times very often. I mean, some of them just do not work today. Yeah. And it's not that they're wrong tafsirs, but they were for their time. Ibn Umar said the best commentary of the Quran is time itself. And so you have to be careful with taking something that was written 1,000 years ago. There were very different assumptions about the world, about people, and those are contingent. They change with time. They're temporal things. Whereas I think he really wanted to see what was transhistorical, what's permanent, the permanent truths.
The other thing that came out is he was an expert, as you've already alluded to, in the Eastern tradition.
Right.
And because of that, I think he brings a unique perspective, like the shaytan al-marida, right?
Yeah.
A persistent diversion. You can see the psychological, mental sort of component of faith, confusion, guidance and misguidance. He would often use these terms, and I think that they were quite unique in that way, making, I think, the translation far more accessible to the Western mind.
Right.
And because there are all these barriers, as you've mentioned, sometimes you read a translation and you can tell that it's a translation. It wasn't written in the
Right.
in the English language. Oftentimes, when you read Dr. Cleary's translations, you don't feel that there's some chasm that's been crossed in order for you to get access to it. You feel like you're reading it in its
Yeah.
original.
Very smooth, not
Yeah.
clunky. I think also we use it a lot, obviously, in the Zaytuna when we're doing our just emails and literature. And it would oftentimes, when we would look to see how, look at the verse, it's not how we've read it before in the translation. And you would look at it and be like, wow, this is such an interesting word use, a choice that he had. And I think that's important. The other thing, what you mentioned, Sheikh, at the end about just depression. And then earlier that he felt that, Americans or Westerners really couldn't really start to think about Islam. And
Thinking
about Islam.
Yeah.
And I think what he does is he kind of opens this door for the Western audience who are suffering. Undeniably, we
Right.
see it a lot. I mean, we see it in the hospitals, I think, just this sort of, they need to soak their soul in the recital. And I think one of the things that his translation offers them is a read that is easier for them, it's accessible, and I think it can give them some sort of solace, which really is the purpose of revelation.
And that's Arbery is a good example. Whether he was a crypto-Muslim, I don't know, but he definitely says that the Qur'an gave him great solace. And Anna Marie Schimmel's another person who found that in the Abdullah Ansari, in the Munajat. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, the spirituality of our tradition is just so extraordinary, and the fact that so many people are deprived from it because of these prejudices that are very difficult to overcome. And I think that was one of his main, he called his work the 1,000-year project. Like that's how he viewed it. Like he was just this long-term project. And he also, unfortunately, he wanted to do 2 exegesis of the Quran, one for Muslims and one for non-Muslims. And he also wanted to write, I only have the notes of his Arabic grammar book, which are stunning, because his deep knowledge. I mean, I'll give you an example. Somebody brought, because he knew Bengali, he could actually speak Bengali. And his wife, Kazuko, told me, when I asked her, how was his Japanese? She said he spoke beautiful Japanese. Wow. He spoke an older form of Japanese, so when people heard it, they were always struck by But they were talking about Bengali, and this lady, she was actually Urdu speaker who lived in Bangladesh, and she was saying how funny it was that they used the same word to drink and to eat and to smoke. And she said it's kind of ridiculous. And he said, well, actually the root means to consume. So he just really, his knowledge of etymology and just languages, and that's why it is a master's translation in that way. And when that title came to me, the first thing I did was I looked up masters in the dictionary, and the sample sentence was, he has mastered 6 languages. So I knew that it was the appropriate term. I don't want to say master translation, but it is a master's translation. He is probably one of the great translators in human history. I mean, we also forget the role that translators play in the edification of cultures and civilizations about other peoples, but also evoking and sparking renewal and renaissance. So the Renaissance of Europe comes because all this translation happens from the Arabic and the Greek. Because when Constantinople fell and becomes Istanbul, all those Greek scholars move into Europe, and so they bring the original Greek texts that were not available to the Latinate speakers. And then the Muslim Arabic comes in. So we have these great, Sylvester, the Pope learns the Arabic numerals and brings them into Europe, and that radicalizes mathematics. So we forget the role of translators. Dr. Cleary, we have an unpublished essay that he wrote called Islam and the New American Renaissance. And it's a stunning essay, but one of the things that he says in there, he says, most Americans would be shocked with the idea that Islam has anything to offer in terms of a renaissance. But he said the reality of it is the biggest crises in America are things that Islam has navigated incredibly well. And he said one of them is commercial law. And he said because so much of the problems in America are a direct result of the unjust economic system, which is exploitative capitalism. Because Muslims are not against quote unquote capitalism per se, but they're against exploitative, unethical capitalism, usury, which is the basis of modern capitalism. And he also saw the family, because he really felt the real crisis globally is the breakdown of family. And one of the things that he said in that essay, which really struck me, is he said, people think that the nuclear family is a family. He said the nuclear family is already a sign that the family has completely broken down. Because he said our real family is aunts and uncles and cousins and first cousins and second cousins. That's real family. It's not the nuclear family. And that's why when it's reduced to a nuclear family, all you need is to split that nucleus and you have this toxic waste that poisons the society. So you have all these feral young boys that have never known fathers. And they're wreaking havoc on these cultures and societies. We have all these single mothers that are suffering because of the breakdown. And I'm going to talk about that with Jane Austen, so I'll say that. Because she's the great author of marriage, and the importance of making a good marriage.
I think we were going to open it up.
If there's, I'm fine with
they
that.
have a mic
we have some time.
We have some microphones out.
So,
MashaAllah. It's so beautiful, the vine motifs, because the vine, you'll find the vine motif in many mosques and churches, because the vine was the transitional vegetative being that moved into animality because it had a kind of willfulness that other plants don't have. And so they saw it as this transitional form, because the vine it can move and can go over things and around things. Other plants don't have that type of volition. The Prophet ﷺ also, it's a kind of apocryphal hadith, but the date palm also is a transitional because it has the male and the female. It needs to be pollinated.
Assalamu alaikum, Sayyidi. Thank you for that astonishing talk. That staggering quote at the end about depression. As someone who is diagnosed as clinically depressed and has been living with this for a few years, that resonated very, very deeply. And I was wondering if Dr. Cleary was speaking from lived experience.
He definitely was speaking from lived experience. He had very profound empathy and was deeply troubled by a lot of when I explored his office, he had so many files on all the horrors that were being done to people around the world. He was very concerned about, he has whole files on the Kurds and what were done to the Kurds, on Afghanistan and what happened in Afghanistan. So he was very, very interested. And he actually, in a letter to me, he said, I'm particularly interested in Central Asia. And he considered the Irish originally from Central Asia. Yeah, he definitely, in one email, he actually, in response to a very depressing story, he said, I'm fasting from sadness right now out of a surfeit. In other words, there's just too much of it. So I'm not reading anything negative right now. So he was definitely speaking from firsthand experience, yeah, I would say. But he also had this incredible ability to, I think just because he had just this extraordinary capacity to observe his own thoughts. And he's written several works on meditation, and so he was very adept at, he knew his own mind very well.
Assalamu alaikum. So regarding the recitation and that effect on helping with symptoms of depression, I have heard this from our teachers many times in terms of reciting Arabic Qur'an in order to help alleviate symptoms of depression. So I did want your take on when your English is your primary language and with sources like this coming out that can be extremely beneficial as well. What is the balance of being capable of reciting Arabic and gaining that benefit for the heart in an unspoken way or an non-understanding way versus an English translation that would penetrate in a way that's more meaningful in terms of just being raised in English-speaking countries and households. And I also wanted, if you could expand on, you touched on it a bit about empathy, but just empathy in relation to depression and that connection in terms of people who are empaths and why it leads to and why it is many times concomitant with depression.
Well, one thing about the Qur'an is the sounds. In fact, there's now all this research on the effect of these just doing these nasalized sounds on people and how that affects their well-being. And one of the most interesting things about the Qur'an is that you are supposed to recite it with tajweed. And the tajweed forces you to do a lot of nasalization. It forces you to do, I mean, I shouldn't really say forces, but because you do these things, it actually has an impact. So the sounds themselves will impact you. And the more you do them, the greater the impact. So the Qur'an will have a very powerful impact just without even understanding it, just by simply reciting the Arabic. So it's really amazing to do that. And also the tajweed, the mudud are very interesting. There's a sahih hadith, the Prophet they asked about his qira. He said, "Can you muddu al-Quran madda?" He used to elongate. If you read Riwayat Warsh, for instance, which has the longest of the mudud, and it was the preferred recitation of Nafi' of Imam Malik radhiyallahu anhu, it just has an effect on you doing that. In terms of the empaths, I mean, they say about 10% of the population, I don't know where they get these numbers from, but are what they call hypersensitive people, HSPs. And it's very real, you know, people who can get into the pain of other people. If you're one of those people, you have to protect yourself because it's like being a turtle without a shell. Personally, I can't look at images. A lot of people look at these images. I personally can't do it because I will get physically sick looking at a lot of the images that people look at. I don't want to see babies blown up and things like that because I can read about it. I don't need to see the images, but some people are able to do that. Apparently, according to Dave Grossman, about 2% of the population can kill other people without having any difficulty. They'll just have dinner and go to sleep. But 98% of people have trauma from taking life. That's why you have such high rates of suicide after wars. There's one Sahabi who, the Prophet ﷺ, he couldn't bring himself to kill a lamb for the dhibh. And he told the Prophet, he said, I just can't do it. And he said, Allah will show you mercy because of the mercy that you have in your heart. So he didn't negate it. He kind of said that man was probably what they call an empath or HSP. He just did not want to take blood. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi said that he never slaughtered an animal. So there are people that just would find that very difficult to do. So, and one of the most beautiful things about our Prophet ﷺ is he just accepted people the way they were. One of my favorite stories is Hassan ibn Thabit when he was protecting the women, and then one of the mushrik was trying to get up, and she gave the sword to Hassan, and he started shaking, and he was a poet. He couldn't even hold it, and she took it, and she went and defended but the Prophet, nobody blamed him or found fault in him, or called him a coward, or it was just who he was. And they understood that. And the Prophet said his sword is his tongue. That's what he fights with.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan, alhamdulillah. It's a great honor to be in the same room with you.
Astaghfirullah.
Alhamdulillah. My question is, could you please clarify if Dr. Thomas Cleary took the Shahada, and if not, how does that affect?
We heard him say Shahada many times.
Excuse me?
We heard him say, he said Shahada publicly many times. When he taught at Zaytuna, he would always say Shahada. Whenever anybody became a Muslim, he would always say Shahada with them. So we heard him say Shahada many, many times. Somebody asked him if he was a Muslim. I think part of why he was trying to do something, he did not want to be boxed in. I think he thought it would affect his work. But it's very clear from those who knew him very well that he loved the Prophet. He believed that the Qur'an was a revelation, but he was a deeply private person. Somebody asked him, and I was standing next to him once, and somebody said, "Are you a Muslim?" And he said, "Are you the Grand Inquisitor?"
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Shukran.
I mean, if you read his introductions, I think it's very clear what his position is. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Sheikh, a few times you've referenced Dr. Cleary's creativity in translating. In terms of Islamically, I don't hear a lot around the concept of creativity, imagination, and where ideas come from. Would you be able to kind of clarify or give us some advice around that, please?
Well, I mean, by creative, I think I'm thinking of just coming up with very unusual solutions to the problem. Translation is a problem. The Italians have a phrase, because treachery and translation are very similar in Italian. So they have a phrase that says translation is treachery. A translator always has difficulties because languages are, while we obviously we're all human and we communicate, languages, the Arabs say likulli lisan insan. You know, every tongue has another person. And when you learn another language, it always is going to have an effect on you because you'll see things differently if you learn languages. And that's why languages are so historically so important in education. Like every educational system, you know, in Canada and McDonald's, they say, you know, we're bilingual. So the Americans going there always say, you know, we're not even monolingual in America anymore, you know. Because a lot of people you can't even understand. They talk now in coded language, and they had recently a linguist give a commencement speech in the language that they use on their texting, and you couldn't understand any of it. So language is extremely important. The Qur'an can never be, no translation will ever capture the extraordinary vastness of the Arabic language. It's not possible. You could probably do it more in expanded notes and things like that, but it's just the words are too, and there are many, many examples of that in the Quran. Also, for instance, in the qira'at, like you have Maliki Yawmiddin, you have Maliki Yawmiddin, you have Maliki Yawmiddin, and they all have nuanced meanings because Malik is a possessor, Malik is a sovereign, Malik is also a type of possessor and a sovereign. So, and then you have, like, I'll give you an example. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. So that's an example of a pronominal suffix, which Arabic and Hebrew have. English doesn't have it. But when you say iyaka na'budu, when you use the pronoun of object, so that's an object, iyaka, to you, right? Na'budu, we worship. So that is done when you mean only you. Because if I said na'buduka, then I could also worship the sun and the moon and the stars as well. But when you say iyaka na'budu, it means to you only. We don't worship anything else but you. You'd have to say that in more than just what the Arabic is allowing you to say. So there are many examples of that in the Quran. I think that's what we mean. You know, my father was opposed to the idea of creative writing because he said all great writing is imitation, not creative. The way they used to teach people to write was to take great sentences from great writers, and then you would have to imitate the sentence structure to learn how to write. So translation is very difficult, although AI, I think, is going to eliminate translators. I'm pretty convinced of it now. I think translators will become more technical editors because the AI is getting very sophisticated with translation.
If I was wondering if you could expound on one of the examples that you provided. فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَذِكْرِكُمْ آبَاءَكُمْ وَأَشَدَّ ذِكْرًا. I think that was the example that was mentioned. Yeah. Now, as we know, the Udhkur being here the Amr, I was wondering as to how the doctor managed to transpose it into an ismi meaning, as you mentioned. You know, obviously the fa taqibiyya before it, and then Udhkur after.
The remembrance.
Yeah, remembrance.
So I think
that's very similar.
That's what. Yeah.
That's a good example.
He's just saying it's a noun.
Yeah.
In the translation.
Sometimes he uses it as a noun.
Yeah, but in that usage.
Yeah. Sometimes he uses it as a noun and other times as a verb. But it is in classical English, it was used as a verb particularly in poetry and in religious literature. To remembrance God was a verb. So that example, the Arabs used to do, they would commemorate their fathers, their ancestors. And so Allah is saying, commemorate God the way you commemorate your fathers, and even more intensely. So, the Prophet ﷺ said, in Allah told the Prophet, it's a dhikrun laka wa liqawmika. It's a remembrance for you and your people. Malik said it was being able to say, fulan an fulan an fulan an fulan. Like the isnad would always exist in the ummah. And so it's a way of remembrance, these amazing people that passed on this tradition over time so that we don't forget them. So the isnad, I'll give you an example. Historically, on the 17th of Ramadan, there are a lot of poems that have all of the shuhada of Badr, and they would be commemorated on that day just as a way of remembering great people and what they did. It's important to remember. There's so many great people that, like Tsailun, everybody should know that person, the man who invented paper. Like, he's probably benefited humans more than 99.9% of humans that ever existed, and yet very few people know him. Or Jenner, he saved countless lives. These people that did these amazing things. We were looking at like Carrie Nation, Carrie Nation, amazing lady. These people should be. They make these films about people that never existed, and yet there's so much richness in people that existed. It'd be much better to tell their stories than the stories of, Captain Marvel. So the vice president of our college just asked me to. We're actually getting charity status in England, and so anybody that wants to support the college, we're trying to build something for the ummah. Al-Azhar benefited the whole ummah, so these institutions aren't just for the places that they exist in. We've had several people from England study at Zaytuna now. We have the 12,000 strong. Also, we have the book club. I'm so happy that this festival, Saima and her team, she was obviously inspired to start this festival. And then we've had just wonderful, like Farhanda has been such an amazing liaison for us, and the whole team here of just having, even though this is not obviously a Muslim venue, just the fact that Muslims are part of this, because many years ago I came to Bradford. Some of you probably weren't even born yet, but it was right after the riots, and I told the people, there was 5,000 people there. They actually had, if you look up the newspapers, you'll find it. But I told them, I said, you shouldn't be rioting. Allah says, يُخْرِبُونَ بِيُوتِهِمْ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ. They tear down their own homes with their hands. Like, why would you want to do that? I said, you guys have to think about how to make a much better Bradford. Like, the Muslims should, because you're becoming huge parts of these populations, and you should contribute. England is this amazing place that has, it's got horrors in its history, like many civilizations, and we can talk all day long. I'm mostly Irish, and I'm green. My ancestors came to America 1764 on my mother's side from Ireland, and 1838 on my father's side. So the Irish can tell you about the horrors of England. But there's also many great and amazing things about this country and about its people like Hannah More, William Wilberforce, Granville, just amazing people that work to make the world a better place. And those are the people we should focus on and honor, because we can all look at the horrors of the past. The Prophet did not want to do that. He wanted to look at the best of people and remind people. "Udhkuru mahasin mautakum." He said, remember the good of your dead. Don't remember their bad. Remember the good of your dead. And so if we all just focus on the negativity of the past, it's just a horrible world. And there's enough negativity to go around. The great Helen Keller, she said, while the world is full of suffering, you can't forget that it's also filled with the overcoming of suffering. There's millions of mothers all over the world waking up in the middle of the night to suckle their children, and these acts of sacrifice and mercy and rahmah. Every day it's happening. And so if we just look at the negative, you just get depressed, and then Iblis wins. That's why Dr. Cleary said there's no use mourning a self-destructive world. It only adds to the toll of victims and the devil's triumph. He said, keep your humanity where nobody can take it, and celebrate the goodness that's in you, just that it's still there, that you're still a human being. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khairan. Yeah, subhanakallah wa bihamdika.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast with Bradford Literature Festival. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share this episode with others, and leave a rating. Mark your calendars for the return of Bradford Literature Festival, Friday the 3rd to Sunday the 12th of July, 2026.